Hello, everyone. We're in the distillery here at Mount Vernon, and look forward to talking to you today a little bit about the history of the site and what's going on over the last 14 years since we reconstructed this 18th century type distillery. The distillery was Washington's last commercial business before he passed away. So this whiskey at Mount Vernon really didn't start on a commercial scale until 1797. And it's tied to the hiring of a very important individual named James Anderson. James Anderson was hired as farm manager for this 8,000-acre estate, and he was originally from Scotland, from Inverkeithing. And back in Scotland, he had been a distiller and a farmer and also operated manufacturing mills. So he knew the business frontwards and backwards. And when he gets the job here at Mount Vernon in January 1797, one of the first letters he writes George Washington and proposes an idea, which is you need a distillery behind your grist mill. Washington at this time is 65 years of age. He's coming home soon from the presidency, and he's a little hesitant about the idea of distilling at Mount Vernon. And we have some primary source documentation that's interesting in some of his comments about it. He writes a friend and he says about his grist mill, he says, I have many idlers at my mill. Mills are meeting places. People go there to get news, drop off grain, pick up product. And Washington was concerned if whiskey was being made right near the mill, what sort of, I guess you could say, unsavory characters might be around seeking to get alcohol. He also wrote that he didn't know a lot about the business of alcohol. Washington enjoyed alcohol throughout his life. His favorite was Madeira wine and porter beer. You can find letters during the French and Indian War and through the Revolution of him procuring alcohol for the troops, which was an important part of their sustenance for many reasons. So he certainly knew the role of alcohol in society and the military, but to run a business is a different story. So it took some convincing by James Anderson, but what in the end convinced Washington was there was profit to be made. And in the 18th century, they did not barrel age whiskey, which meant you could make it, and the next day it could be shipped into town and sold. It was a clear alcohol. That's how people consumed it. And being 9 miles from Alexandria, Virginia, there was a huge market for this product. So Washington agreed, but they started on a small scale initially. Next to the mill, there was a building where they made barrels called the cooperage. And Washington allowed Anderson and James Anderson's son, John, to set up 2 stills in the cooperage in 1797. And basically that was a test case to see how well it would do. And they made several hundred gallons. It sold quite well. Washington was pleased, and he agreed to build a large dedicated distillery, which we are now standing in the reconstruction of. So that distillery broke ground of the construction in 1797 in October. And as I mentioned, when we're in the grist mill, we're fortunate to have all these records to really tell a complete story about what happened on the estate in Washington's time. And the construction of the distillery was a pretty fast one. It was up and running by March 1798, and they installed 5 copper pot stills. So it's now moving into commercial production. When you have a couple stills, 1 or 2 stills on a farm is not unusual. For most farmers, a small still was a piece of equipment they needed. It was basically part of the agricultural operation. But when you move into having 5 copper pots, what you're stepping into is commercial production. And in 1798, on this site, Washington's team of 2 paid staff and 6 enslaved men made 4,500 gallons of whiskey. It's a lot of whiskey. But the banner year for production was 1799, the last year of Washington's life, when the distillery here made almost 11,000 gallons of rye whiskey and smaller amounts of peach and apple and persimmon brandy. So I like to say that Washington, although hesitant, once he got the business rolling, it was really quite productive and quite profitable for him. But it's important to remember, had he not hired James Anderson, the Scottish immigrant, it's very likely that none of the distilling would have been brought to this commercial size. He had the experts and the people that knew how to run it. So after Washington's death, his nephew inherits this farm, Lawrence Lewis. Lawrence had married Nellie Custis, and if you visited this area, you can see Woodlawn Plantation, a house up on the hill across from us, and that's the home that they built in 1804. He carried on the business for a few more years. It was really never as profitable under Lewis's leadership. And sadly, in 1814, something happened here, an accident of some sort, and the distillery burned down. So if you fast forward to the 1930s, late 1920s, the state of Virginia did archaeology on this site, and they found the remains of the mill, and they reconstructed the mill. They found the remains of the distillery, but they decided, let's not rebuild the distillery. And I often ask people, gee, why was that? Well, Prohibition was ongoing. And they figured there's no point in asking the state or the feds for permission to rebuild a distillery. So this was covered back over. A historic marker was put here indicating where the distillery was. And time marched on. When Mount Vernon took over the grist mill from the state and made it operational, one of the key things we knew was there was the distillery back here, and we wanted to find out more about it. So we did 6 years of archaeology on the site and uncovered the whole foundations, the whole features. And what we realized was there's enough here to rebuild it. And the second part of that is we also had the records, the ledgers, the letters between James Anderson and Washington, letters between Washington and people he sold the whiskey to or got grain from. So we had a pretty complete picture. And we raised money through the great help of the Distilled Spirits Council, which funded this. And they're a trade organization that represents a lot of the major companies you would know in the liquor business and spirits business. So we reconstructed it from 2004 to 2007. We opened it up in March 2007. And we made one small barrel that year for the opening, working with a number of major master distillers, people like Jimmy Russell, Joe Dangler, Dave Pickerel, other people those that know whiskey would know those names. And for me, I was new to this. I'd been a miller. I enjoyed doing it, started to learn from these people. And I thought, well, wow, every once in a while, we'll maybe make some whiskey. And then in 2009, we decided to make a first batch here. And so we hired Dave Pickerel to be our consultant. He had just left Maker's Mark. And Dave came and helped us figure out how to ferment and mash in the old way. And we made about 100 gallons and we about killed ourselves. It was so hard and so arduous. But that next year of 2010, that first unaged whiskey, the first really since Washington's time, sold out in 3 hours. So we realized this is something that there's a demand for. And ever since then, we make 2 to 3 runs of spirits a year. And over the period of time, we've gotten better at it, I can say, and we're making more and more quality spirits as we go through the years. So it's a great place to tell the story of Washington the entrepreneur. It's a great place to come to Mount Vernon and learn about the milling, distilling, the farms, but also partake of products from the mill, from the distillery, that are made in a period accurate way. Now to talk a little bit about how we make it, over here on this side of the room, we have the main components really, which is a boiler, 210 gallon boiler. They bring fresh water in from the well, and they would ladle in this hot water. And we do it this way when we make our whiskey today. We get a bucket using these ladles, scalding hot water into a fermenter, about 110 gallons of water. And then you're adding in your corn, your rye, and later your malted barley. And this is the device we use to mix and stir all of that, which is a mash rake. So this will hold about 110 gallons, as I said. The corn and rye go in first. They're cooked for a period of time. Then you add your malted barley at the appropriate time, which then converts starch to sugar. And after that cools sufficiently, you'll add your yeast. And the yeast will go to work on those sugars, converting them to alcohol. So that's the basics, real basic description of fermentation. But once the yeast is put in here, you do 3 to 5 days fermentation. And we find in our setup today, we do usually 3, sometimes 4 days of fermentation. Then you have distiller's beer, or mash, which you're going to then bucket by hand to the stills. And the stills are just big copper pots. They're just set inside these brick fireboxes like ovens. And the copper pot has an opening on top, and we can bucket that mash right inside. Once it's filled, you're going to cap the still. We connect the pipe in here, and then you're going to build your wood fire. And the basics of distillation is that alcohol has a lower boiling temperature than water. So by heating up what's in the pot, the alcohol is going to burn off first. So that will turn into steam or vapor. It'll float up to the head of the still, travel down this line arm, and go down the pipe, which is in this barrel here. And you're unable to see it, but inside the barrel is a spiral coil. And if you've ever seen pictures or imagery of early distilling, you've probably seen these coils. And what we'll do is run water from the mill race down the trough through this barrel to cool that pipe. And that will then condense the gas back to liquid, which will flow out the back. And we collect it right back there with a pot or a pan. Out front comes water, hot water that's just, gets warm in the barrel. We want to drain that out, backfill with cool water, and then that's how you get your distillate. That's then collected, and on another day, you'll run it back through a second time. We sometimes do a third time. double or triple distillation. We know in Washington's time, everything was double distilled. And that improves the spirit, but also increases the alcohol content, the concentration. So we finished up running stills just yesterday, stuff we hadn't finished in March, and on some of the runs that were coming off at 155 proof. You don't want to drink that. You want to cut that down to a level that you enjoy. But that's how you get that increased alcohol strength and content. So when you think about 1799, doing it this way to make 11,000 gallons, I mean, those 8 men working in here, we have a lot of admiration for the labor that was involved in producing whiskey this way. And to produce that amount is still astronomical, because we'll produce about 600 to 700 proof gallons in 3 weeks. And again, you think of those numbers of the 18th century, it's really quite amazing what they achieved, particularly the equipment that they had. So, and if you look at distilling history, go back in time in any state, this was going on throughout the colonies and throughout early America, throughout the 19th century. As technology grew, distilleries got more advanced and they could produce more in different ways, different stills. And it's fun to visit a distillery today. If you come to Mount Vernon, go visit one in Virginia or Kentucky or anywhere, and you can see the comparison and contrasting of how the industry has changed. But a lot of the science is very much the same. So for Washington, this was very profitable. Sadly, he died December 1799, and he really couldn't enjoy the fruits of the distillery as much as he would have liked. But I think coming here to visit, seeing this site, and partaking of the spirit, you get a real look into the history of Mount Vernon as a working estate. And again, like with the grist mill, really represents that as well. Now, I pulled out some barrels and set them up because we do barrel age here, because we know the market we're in wants aged spirit. So we have some of those out here. And also I thought I'd talk a little bit about some of the different projects we've done here over the years. So our basic mainline products, always is with the unaged rye whiskey. And this is actually the official state spirit of the state of Virginia. And so whiskey, again, was not aged in the 18th century, so it had no color or flavor from the barrel. We jokingly say it aged here from Alexandria. And it would go right into taverns or large stores or be retailed there. So we always make a certain amount of unaged bottles each year. And then we barrel age in 25-gallon barrels, usually a 2-year-old product, which is called straight rye whiskey. So this, you can see what 2 years in a charred oak barrel will do for that. And of course, the flavor profile, very different from the unaged. The unaged, you're getting all the grain. This, you get the benefits of the wood and the different tannins and flavors from the oak that come through. A lot of vanilla and caramel notes in that. We also have our premium whiskey, which is aged 4 years. So this is a beautiful whiskey. It's really right now our premium that we offer. So that's kind of the top of the line of what's produced here. Now, if you go back, when the archaeology was going on here, there was actually distilling that went on here in a small still made by the Vendome company out of Louisville, Vendome Copper and Brass Works. And they made our stills here. But in the early days, they made a small still, which was a copy of a still the Smithsonian owned from 1790s. And they set that up outside in the grass, not far from the grist mill. And they brought in that team of master distillers, as I mentioned, to include Jimmy Russell of Wild Turkey, Joe Dangler, Ron Coil, Dave Pickerel, Mike Sherman from Vendome. And they produced small batches of the first GW whiskey, which was then used for fundraising. And that was how we also raised money for the project. But also a group of distillers shipped barrels of whiskey here from several companies, and they combined those and bottled those into what was called a vatted whiskey. And there's only about 5 of these bottles that we have here at Mount Vernon left. But that was done again to fundraise. That was a combination of all those major distilleries that were helping us out. So, what's neat here is I don't get to open this, but at least I get to handle some of these rare bottles. And if you want to see that label up close, you can see the mansion on the front of that. So it's just a beautiful thing. And it really commemorated the history, but also the restoring of the distillery. During that time, because there were some rum companies that were involved in the early fundraising, we also made Martha Washington rum. And I'd like to do this again in the future. We have some rum we'll talk about here in a little bit, but that's a beautiful label, and that was also related to fundraising. Now, after making the first whiskeys, we decided in the ledger we saw Washington made brandy. And like any large estate, Washington had orchards. And so, again, you got to think of the orchards as really not growing apples or peaches for eating. These were grown to make cider or spirits out of. So in the early 1760s, Washington actually purchases 2 small stills. So I believe as early as the 1760s, he's probably distilling on a very small scale, like most farmers, making brandies. And I have some evidence in 1770s that I'm tracking down that there was likely a little bit of whiskey distilling going on here on a small scale, but that's still stuff we're digging into. So we decided, let's make brandy. And with the help again of the Distilled Spirits Council, we put together a team of craft distillers along with Dave, and we made some apple brandy, this is our earlier label. And this was, went very well. It was a marketing PR event, a lot of press here. And we worked with people like Ted Huber of Starlight Distillery in Indiana, who's been a great partner over the years. And again, of course, this is aged brandy. So the apples where it started. Then we thought, well, we know he made peach. We can see it in the ledger. So then we decided, let's make peach brandy, which we did a year later. And this was aged in a used barrel, so it's lighter in color, but we made the peach brandy, and we also made a peach eau de vie, which is unaged brandy. And what we were looking at doing once we started this was, let's make everything we know that Washington made. So that's kind of been the path we've been on. Then probably the most special bottles we've ever made were related to these barrels on top here. We made single malt whiskey in 2012, and this was the 100th anniversary of the Scotch Whisky Association. And so they contacted the Distilled Spirits Council, spoke with our team here, and they said, we'd like to make single malt whiskey in honor of the history of the influence of Scotland in America, but particularly at Mount Vernon with James Anderson. And so we were able to work with 3 Scottish distillers and Dave Pickerel to produce the single malt whiskey. So as you all probably know, it can't be called Scotch if it's made here. Scotch is made in Scotland. It's all malted barley, water, and yeast. So we worked with Bill Lumsden of Glenmore and G, Andy Camp from Cardew. That's where all the Johnny Walkers made. And John Campbell of Lefroy, who has continued to help us over the years. John's a great friend. And we produce single malt whiskey here, a very rare number of bottles. And these are signed bottles, gentlemen, as well. So we only have a few of these left. And this was probably the most fun project we've done, one of the top 2 projects we've done. So again, this was all for various charities. We donated bottles to various charities, raised money for Mount Vernon as well. So this was just a special project. And these were aged in these barrels. And if you know, in the Scotch whiskey industry, they purchase American whiskey barrels and bourbon barrels to age Scotch in. And so what Bill Lumsden did for us is he procured barrels in Scotland that had come from America, coopered them down to the size we needed because we were doing small runs. And we also had him cooper down some Madeira barrels. So that whiskey was aged 2 years, 8 months in oak, American oak used, and the last 4 months in Madeira. And again, we were weaving history through that whole project because Washington's favorite drink was Madeira. So as far as our bread and butter products, the rye and the brandies, we continue to make those, but every so often, we're very fortunate to be able to work on special projects. And that's one of the neat things I think about Mount Vernon is it brings people together. And in all aspects of the estate, from the gardens, the grounds, the house, people that work in preservation, there's experts that come from all over to help. And with that comes relationships that we carry on. So the single malt was very special. And then the rum we did in 2018. So this is the unaged rum, obviously, the silver rum. And Joe Bondi, who's head of our development office, fundraising arm, came to me and said, can you guys make rum? And I said, why do you want us to make rum in a whiskey distillery? And he said, well, we're going to republish Washington's Barbados diaries. And this was the diaries he wrote when he was a teenager, when he went to Barbados with his older brother, Lawrence. It's his only trip outside the continental United States and North America. So it's very influential on him on sea travel, seeing markets, seeing the rum and sugar markets. So I talked with our consultant, Lisa Wicker. Lisa runs Widow Jane in Brooklyn, and said, can you help us make rum? And she said, sure. And she said, you ought to call Maggie Campbell as well. Maggie's a rum distiller up in New England that runs Privateer Rum. So those 2 talented ladies came here and helped us learn how to make rum off molasses. We made about 165 of these bottles that were for all the fundraising effort. But right down here is a cask of aged rum. And I was happy to tell Joe and Doug Bradburn, our CEO, that this rum's ready to be bottled soon. And here's just a little sample of it after time in the barrel. So it's a used bourbon barrel, so it's not going to get as dark as a whiskey might. it's ready. It's really nice. And some of this will be retail. So keep your eyes open for that to get some George Washington rum. Couple other special barrels I brought out. This barrel right here, if you look closely, it's George Washington rye whiskey, but it's distilled at LeBrot and Graham. And Chris Morris is the master distiller at what is now called Woodford Reserve. And so he was out in those early distillations. But this particular barrel was shipped to us by Dave Sherrick, who used to be the master distiller there. And he actually rebuilt LeBrot and Graham Distillery, which is a historic structures, and created Woodford Reserve. So we have a deep tie to Kentucky with some of the work that we've done, and that barrel's a special one. And I think one last one here to show you, and then I think I'll probably, if it's time, open it up for some questions. But I don't know if Sarah can come any closer or see the top of this barrel, perhaps. But this was made in 2017 and has a bunch of signatures on it. This was the 10th anniversary distillation of the reopening of this building. So it opened 2007. We did a special distillation with our consultants and a bunch of other distillers, and the people from Discus were involved. But this is a special barrel, and I have plans to finish this in Madeira. And so at some point down the road, we'll have another special release of a limited number of bottles that are done that way. So kind of want to cover the history and then what's gone on since we've reopened. And the other thing to not forget in here is the major focus of this site, like all our sites, is education about the time period, the work of the people that lived and worked here, of Washington's businesses. So what's neat about our sites here with the mill and distillery is they really weave all of that together. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions y'all might have.
Yeah, we've got a lot lined up for us. Alex asked, how much did whiskey cost back then?
Wholesale for Washington's unaged was 60 cents a gallon, which seems like a great deal, unless you factor in what are the wages of a common worker in that time period. If it was distilled more times, the rectified whiskey, they called it, which was distilled up to 4 times, that was a better quality, higher proof, that was $1 a gallon.
Okay, and Robert asks, was George Washington's Mount Vernon, was this the only whiskey that existed in the 18th century, or were there other types?
There were many, many, many thousands of them. In fact, by early 1800s, in Virginia and Maryland, there's over 3,500 distilleries. So distilling history is woven deep into the fabric of our nation. In fact, the record of the first distillation in Virginia goes back to 1619 at Berkeley Plantation. And you've got to think of it too, everybody thinks of the drinking of it, which had happened, but it is a commodity that's also legal tender. So the further west you go to get grain back or to markets on the east, if you can distill it and transport it that way, you're going to be much better off, and it increases the value. So certainly Americans enjoyed drinking, but it was part of the economic force behind farming and agriculture as well.
All right, and Lily asks, what kind of wood are the barrels made of? Good question.
Yeah, these are all American oak, with the exception of the Madeira barrels, which I don't know the complete provenance on those, but we usually go in American oak.
And Cynthia has a two-parter. Did he keep the books himself of revenues, costs, profits, and losses, or did the distillery manager keep these books, notes, and have, for instance, regular meetings with Washington about progress?
Over the years, you find some ledgers where it's Washington's hand, but as his career changes and his life grows and Mount Vernon grows, he always has a farm manager. Sometimes it's a relative, like during the American Revolution, Lund Washington was basically in charge of the business of the estate. And then later he'll have farm managers, and he expected them to send him weekly farm reports. And they were very detailed, even down to the number of piglets that were born on each farm. Washington wanted to know every detail. So you mostly see writings of other clerks or farm managers or people that do the sort of bookkeeping for him. But you will find in those ledgers, even when he's president, Washington will look it all over, and you can see his signature at the bottom of the page saying, I have read through all these and they're in balance and I agree, and he'll sign. So if you worked for him, you knew he was going to check your math and check your numbers.
All right, and then Cynthia said, is the recipe for whiskey that you are making the same as that in Washington's time? And in his time, what would have differentiated his whiskey from that of his competitors?
Well, the prevalent whiskey back then in this part of the world was rye whiskey, which means the predominant grain in the mash bill or recipe is rye. So Washington's whiskey was around 60% rye, 30 to 35% corn, and the rest was malted barley. We're running really close to that mash bill. So we do it as close as that, very near it. Now, there are other mash bills out there. There's corn whiskey, which was a lot of corn, could be 80% corn. Some people were malting rye and not barley, not using any barley. So just like in a kitchen, when people cook, there's a lot of different ways to approach it. That was the creativity in the times back then as well. But they're also building off the knowledge of what they had in Europe as they came over here. But you think of a Scottish man coming, he wasn't going to make single malt whiskey because the market here wanted rye whiskey. The other thing about rye was in that time period, it was cheap grain. It wasn't made into a lot of breadstuffs. It was a cover crop used in crop rotation. So you're not going to just pull all your corn out of your fields because that's food. So, but that argument between feeding the stomach and feeding the body with alcohol, you can look in the records in Scotland and America, there were worries even by our founding fathers that with all the distilling going on, there's not going to be enough grain for bread. So you sometimes think these things are all simpatico, and in fact, sometimes they're running against each other in different times, like when there's shortage of food. So it's interesting, a part of the history of spirits and grain.
And Stacy said, is the whiskey more like Scotch or Irish whiskey?
I wouldn't put it in either category, really, because Scotch is all malted barley. There's a variety of flavor profiles with it, depending on how long they ferment and how they push their stills. Irish whiskey is beautiful whiskey. It's usually triple pot distilled. But a rye whiskey, because of the ingredient of rye, is very peppery and spicy. So the flavor profile you get is black pepper, hot notes like that. You're not going to get the smoothness that you get out of an Irish whiskey or that malt flavor you get from the grain in Scotland. So, and that's one thing about whiskey. If you're not a whiskey drinker, there's so many different types out there. You need to find something you enjoy. Like, again, it's akin to food. Some people love certain dishes and others won't touch it. There's a lot of different variety, a lot of different places that make it differently off different raw materials. So you got to, jokingly, I'll say, you got to keep searching until you find the one you like.
And Lily said, did the Washingtons ever offer the whiskey to their guests to take home with them?
To take home, I'm not sure, but I do know that he kept barrels of whiskey in the mansion in the cellar. And at the time of his death, we have the inventories, and you can see that there's brandy and whiskey made here at his distillery that was there for entertaining his guests, along with wine and Madeira and other imports.
And Miriam asked, how many barrels of whiskey did they make at one time?
Well, if you run the numbers to make 11,000 gallons in a year, you have to do about 50 finished gallons. That means double distilled a day. And so they shipped in 31-gallon barrels. So there'd probably be a couple, not a massive amount, but it's going through the night sometimes. So I'd have to run the math back because there were different size barrels, not just 31-gallon. But suffice it to say, to reach that level, this was extremely busy place, and those men that worked here were turning it out hour upon hour. And I often think they probably worked at shifts sometime to get that much whiskey made.
And Doug said, of the single malt, peach brandy, and apple brandy, which did George Washington consume the most of?
That's a good question. It's a hard one to know. I think that he loved Madeira, and there's a lot of shipments of Madeira, and I know from the records he enjoyed a lot of porter beer. So I almost think Madeira and porter were probably drank the most, and depending on the guests, he would, have brandy. He certainly enjoyed brandy. He tried one time to get a quality barrel of brandy here in Virginia to ship to Lafayette, and we have that letter. And it's interesting because Washington says, I really couldn't find any Virginia brandy that was basically up to par with what you can get in France. So I decided not to send any, but Martha Washington sent Virginia hams, which she was very proud of, and really was something that was a staple in Virginia. So but the letter's interesting because I think Washington had drank enough of imported brandy to know what the quality was there coming out of Europe.
And Tigers on YouTube said, did Washington own any flasks or whiskey glasses?
He had large decanters, which we still have. I'm not sure how many of them because they're in the small parlor, the small dining room. In the original box he had built to house them. And so when you leave, when you tour the mansion, you're coming out of Washington's study, which is the last room you see. You step through a butler's pantry, and on your right is a doorway where you can see the small dining room. And on the floor there are those original decanters in that case. And I believe it's probably even, you can find that on our website. So he certainly procured a lot of finery for entertaining and dining. And with that came a myriad of type of glasses and decanters for spirits.
And Jeanette said, could you talk about the enslaved workers who worked at the distillery?
Yes, there were 6 men here. I believe Timothy was the youngest. He was really a boy. He was 14. And they're listed as distillers in the records we have here. And they were highly skilled men. Again, you can't just throw stuff in a barrel and not know the particulars of how to cook or how to run the still in order to achieve quality whiskey. So I think the work that was done here was high quality. The whiskey sold so very well, and without them here, they wouldn't have happened. And keep in mind, in addition to the enslaved workers here, you have coopers here on site making barrels for the whiskey and for the flour. So that coopers was very active. And you also had, as I mentioned, in the grist mill, there was an enslaved miller named Ben. So by the late 1790s, there's about anywhere, depending on the day of the week, 8 to 10 enslaved workers here doing this major production in the skilled labor.
And Sienna asked, how similar are the apples you use for the brandy to the ones you use now? Same for the grain.
The grain is a modern rye and a modern corn, but it is high quality food grade. It's the same supplier in Virginia. We get our grain for the mill and our mill products. We are working with Lisa Wicker's help and others to look toward, in the future, using some heirloom grains. We've worked with Anson Mills in South Carolina on some heirloom grains for the mill. And so that is a plan in the future. On the apples, we work with a gentleman in Maryland who has a huge orchard of about 7,000 trees. And he plants a lot of varietals, but also several that Washington grew. So when we went and did our first apple brandies, and we continue to do this with him, we used the Roxbury Russet, the Hughes Crab, and what was the other one? I'm drawing a blank. We'll put it on the questions, but 3 apples that were varietals that we knew Washington grew here. And keep in mind, again, those apples were grown not for eating for flavor, but for making cider or brandy. So we tried to go as true as we could to the period on the brandy.
And Nathan asks, would George Washington share his recipe with other distillers, or did he keep them a secret?
Well, it's hard to say. I think distillers, it's interesting working with a number of them. And I'll borrow, again, Lisa Wicker's joke that if you ask 14 distillers, you get 18 answers. And everybody has their own way and approach. So with rye whiskey, there's a number of different mash bills. And, I think it's hard to know back then because I think quality today in distillation is a whole different animal than what was probably being produced in the 18th century. They just wanted to get whiskey to market. And I'm sure there's a lot of rough stuff that went to market. But I have no records of anybody coming here to ask Washington or James Anderson or his son John any particulars about their mash bill. And there was a lot of competition. I know they're very proprietarial about yeast today. We know Washington got brewer's yeast from Alexandria. We have that in the early distillations, a record of that, and they would have cultivated that, we think. But again, that's one of those things lost to history. We don't have a definitive answer on that.
All right, we just have time for a couple more questions. We have one from Cynthia. How long on average would it take to make an average barrel of whiskey from harvest of the rye to the point of sale? Whew.
Well, you're going to harvest rye at a certain time of the year, maybe, too warm to distill. So, on the front end, let's just say you get your grain finally to the distillery. Fermentation, 3 to 5 days, a day and a half running stills. And since they didn't age it, within 5 days, 6 days, that could be going to market. In the modern industry, different story. There are white whiskeys out there, an unaged spirit like eau de vie, but people generally want to age minimum of 2 years, and then there's many whiskeys that go much, much longer. So really, you're putting away things for future sales when you barrel age. So it's a different market today.
And Nat asked, was Washington's whiskey considered highly desirable by the locals?
I would say so. If you're moving 11,000 gallons 9 miles from your market's 9 miles from your home, it was very desirable. Now, Washington, if you know his character, he didn't trade on his name. He didn't want to, his name was not on the whiskey barrels like we have to do legally today. It was just marked, as whiskey or, in some form. Went into town. But if you own the tavern and you're buying this whiskey from the wholesaler in Washington, what do you think you're going to say where it came from? Our first president's home. This is Washington's whiskey, and I bet that moved a lot of whiskey back then.
All right, and our last question, we've had quite a few of this. Can you purchase the rye whiskey online, or how can you purchase any of our distilled spirits?
Well, normally you can buy them right here at our gift shops, which, as everyone knows, we're looking toward hopefully figuring out when we're able to reopen to the public again on some level. We have been working on a plan with the state to be able to sell direct to the customers in Virginia. That's still in the works with us, but please do check our website, because if that comes active, you will find the information there. And we're also working on the ability to do curbside pickup. So there's peach brandy in stock, unaged whiskey in stock, 2-year-old whiskey in stock. We are going to bottle some more 4-year-old rye. And looking down the road, this barrel right here, which I'm sampling, this is some of the best whiskey we've made to date, and that's aged in a big barrel, 53 gallons, not 25. And those will be marketed in the not too distant future, 2021, 22. So a lot of good stuff coming, but check mountvernon.org. There'll be more information there. And of course, when we reopen, whenever that date comes, we hope you'll come to the retail shops and get some of these fine spirits that are made here, because you're really buying a piece of history. And actually, if you think about it in the times we're living in, that sort of support goes right to help the educational and preservation mission of Mount Vernon. So we do appreciate that.
All right, well, thank you, Steve. I have a last question for you.
Okay.
Can I try some when we get off the live stream?
Hold that glass over there.
All right, great. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you all.